Hello, I'm Dr. Louis Hoffman, and this video lecture is on conceptions of mental illness over time. It has been developed as part of history and systems courses that I have taught. I want to begin by talking about some of the most prevalent contemporary approaches to diagnosis. The first two on here are very closely related and have a lot of overlap to them. They could even be argued to be combined as one. One is the genetic and the other is the medical and biological. The genetic says that mental illness really is a product of one's genes, whereas the medical biological says it's a part of one's biological makeup, which genes are an important part of. So the medical biological is pretty much always going to include the genetic component, may not be only reduced to the genetic component to it. Then there's more of a psychological deterministic and a social cultural. The psychological deterministic really sees that what we refer to as mental illness comes out of one's own psychological makeup over time. It falls within the individual, but not necessarily reduced just to the biological aspects. And the social cultural really look at some of the external factors, the social factors. Now we see that these often are combined in what is a biopsychosocial model that is talked about commonly, or even a biopsychosocial spiritual model that is sometimes talked about. One example of how these are combined is what's referred to as the diathesis stress model, which says that while there may be a strong genetic component without an environmental factor that also elicits the gene, that the mental illness may not develop. Some of the less popular approaches over time and contemporary include moral punishment, that it really is a consequence of something to do with the individual or group, and the punishment from God or some type of external forces. Culturally dependent perspectives that really view it as something that is emergent within the culture. And then social constructivist perspectives, which view diagnosis as a discourse. It recognizes that what we see as mental illness is strongly influenced by culture and by the biases within the mental health profession. There are more positive reconstructions of mental illness that view a lot of what we refer to as pathology as being adaptive or informative. It may go to the extremes and become maladaptive over time, but its roots is something that's more adaptive or informative. And then there is Szasz's perspective, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, that mental illness is a myth. We'll start off by talking about some of the approaches, and then we'll talk about some of the criticisms over time. So three early approaches include the animistic, the mythological, and the demonological. With all of these, the origins of what is thought of as mental illness is somewhere external. With the animistic, it's not necessarily God, but it's external forces in nature. With the mythological, it's more concrete forces or deities such as God that act upon the person. With the demonological, what's a little different there is it's demons that may possess or influence the individual there. So that possession brings another component to it. Eastern conceptions, there were some parallels, though might be a little bit different in certain ways. There's kind of a magic or sorcery, though those terms I think are really better in the West in some way, but there's still some more superstitious approaches, or what we would think of today as superstitious approaches. These were more rooted in the community or the situation than in the individual, although the same was true to some degree in the West, that the moral punishment, for example, often was based on sins of the community and then later sins of the individual. Within the East, it was more focused within the community. Ancestors were also thought to play a role at times. But again, it's something external beyond the individual that had a lot to do with this. There's also a perspective of a balance of forces, which is more of an internal perspective. And there were some Western ideas that emerged similarly later. The first challengers of the more superstitious, externalized views were philosophers that began challenging it. And they began challenging in the 16th century, and there's movements to more rationalistic approaches and later scientific approaches. A big part of this motivation was the inhumane treatment that often seemed to be connected to some of these more superstitious or metaphysical approaches to understanding what we think of as mental illness. This is a quote by Carl Mininger, an influential psychologist that was writing, I'm not going to remember exactly, but in the mid-1900s, I believe. He stated, when mental illness was regarded as the infestation of the devil or evil spirits, or, at the very best, of sinful thoughts and sinful acts, the logical treatment was abuse, cruelty, and neglect, and this is what the afflicted got. So this really is highlighting that a lot of people, when they were presenting what we talk about as mental illness today, they were treated very poorly in conjunction with what was assumed to be the origins or the causes of these. Early diagnosis then was actually intended to destigmatize some of the religious aspects of the stigma placed on individuals who are suffering. Now, this is somewhat ironic for many people today who argue that diagnosis is really something that causes a lot of stigmatization and can lead to negative treatment. But it is important to recognize that early on, diagnosis was intended to destigmatize some of the religious biases towards people that were suffering in ways that presented itself consistent with what we think of as mental illness. So the early diagnosis emerged from the medical field, which is important in thinking about how we understand it over time. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on. But it emerged from the medical field, so it makes sense that a medical model was the original model that was used. The early motivation, again, was being appalled at the early treatment of the mentally ill, and began to associate mental disorders with brains and nerves as a way to, again, move away some of that stigma and mistreatment. Cullen in the 18th century was one of the first to work on cataloging disorders and catalog many of the physical and psychological disorders of his time, and introduced the idea of neuroses to refer to brain or neurological disorders. This term will evolve a little bit over time, as I'll discuss here shortly. But there are 4 early types of neuroses. Now, as I read these, pay attention to what might be some of the diagnoses we talk about today that you may associate with these. Diminished voluntary motion, diminished involuntary activity, related to normal movement of muscles, and disorders of judgment. So a lot of these are associated with more severe mental illnesses in today's conceptions. Kraepelin in the 19th and 20th century did work around diagnosis, and he bridged 2 primary approaches, one rooted in the brain and one in personal history. So these are 2 different approaches, and they parallel some of the debates that we see today about are mental illnesses biological or brain diseases or rooted in personal history. Kraepelin was advocating for a more compassionate approach and developed the most recognized early diagnostic system. When we look at Freud, Freud can be confusing because we think of Freud a lot in related to early experiences, but his theories were heavily biologically influenced and based in drives or biological drives. There was also the psychological aspect to it. But the way that he approached it really fit well with the medical model yet, with the drives and the early determinist, the early psychological deterministic approaches that were integrated with that. On early diagnosis, and this emerged within psychoanalysis a lot over time as well, was the idea of neuroses and psychosis. Neuroses was more focused on the self, often excessively, and psychosis more on an altered state of consciousness or something separating off from the self. So excessive self versus separation from the self was kind of some of the distinctions that were made here. And again, we start to see more complexly thinking about what we think of as mental disorders today, and more sophisticated ways of distinguishing these are starting to develop over time. But as I mentioned, these came out of the medical field, and the medical model really was the basis. And there's some limitations to that. Elkins is one of the really important critics of the medical model, and he'll talk about this in this quote. The medical model in psychotherapy began with Freud. The procedure, known as psychoanalysis, was a product of the medical community, and everything associated with it was cast in medical terms. So again, we see drawing from that medical term thinking of it as parallel. Hysteria, along with other psychological problems identified by Freud, was a mental illness. A doctor diagnosed the patient on the basis of symptoms and administered treatments to the psychological problems and psychotherapeutic processes as it had been applied to physical illness and healing. So we can see those parallels there. But there are also limitations in this that we'll talk about some as we get to some of the critics. There were two early dominant systems. The first, published in, it has its origins back in the 1850s, but it was first published in 1932. We have the ICD that was emergent from that, so it had its roots in the 1850s, but its first publication was in 1932. And then the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, first published in 1952, a little bit later, but more focused specifically from psychological origins. Now we're going to talk about the history of some of the critiques, and diagnosis has always had its critics, and we'll consider several different approaches. One of those has always been the religious. The one that's really well known today is Scientology, but before Scientology there was many other religious critics of the idea of mental illness. Many of these came from Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but it applies across various religions. They would often argue that what is being conceived as mental illness is either a spiritual problem or an avoidance of taking responsibility. When we think about some of the changes in diagnosis, there are some diagnoses that really can make us ponder and think about the absurdity of the way diagnosis has been seen at times. One of these is drapetomania. This is something talked about by Thomas Szasz, and what it refers to is slaves in early U.S. history that wanted to run away, and the propensity to run away. This was seen as a mental illness, which to us today seems quite shocking and absurd, that to view that a slave wanting to not be a slave and get away would be viewed as a mental illness. But these are some of the types of things that have been conceived and connected with mental illness over time. Similarly, homosexuality was a diagnosis. And there still are a lot of controversies around LGBTQ issues and diagnosis that are quite problematic. But homosexuality was viewed throughout a lot of the history of psychology by most in the field as a mental disorder, until 1973, when it was officially removed from the DSM-2. But it wasn't out of the book until the DS-3 came out, and was replaced by sexual orientation disturbance and then ego-dystonic homosexuality, which were different ways of looking at it, but still had stigma with it, still are something that are criticized over time and today. The way that this is approached in the current DSM still is something that is quite controversial in placing the disorder on the individual instead of within the community. A lot of the research will support that psychological difficulties that many LGBTQ individuals have is a product of the prejudice and the discrimination and the mistreatment that individuals often receive. Now, Spittler was a major influence in removing it, but later became a controversial figure with conversion therapy in acknowledging that it could sometimes work, which is very controversial, and most, including myself, would disagree with his appraisal of the research there. And there are a number of challenges and controversies around that are beyond what I'm going to go into in this lecture that you can find in the literature, but it remains a controversy today, and conversion therapy remains controversial today, as well as many of the other aspects of diagnosis that often get connected with people who are LGBTQ. So this remains to be a controversy that is influenced heavily by popular culture and people's biases, people's beliefs regard to this, including religious and spiritual beliefs. So this can continue to serve in a lot of ways at how one's personal beliefs, including religious and spiritual beliefs, can influence their perspective on psychological disorders. Now, Thomas Szasz is maybe one of the best known critics of diagnosis over time, although he's not as well talked about today, unfortunately. His book, The Myth of Mental Illness, was published in 1960 and was a very influential critique. His radicalness may have worked against him at times and hurt his efforts, but he still did gain a fairly good following, and he also, even people that may have disagreed with aspects of him, still often were influenced by many things that he advocated. I'm going to read some quotes from Szasz then. And this is a quote of Szasz quoting C.S. Lewis in his article, Mental Illness is Still a Myth. Of all the tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. To be cured against one's will and cured of states which we may not regard as disease is to be put on the level with those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or with those who never will, to be classified with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. So this, too, is a pretty radical statement by C.S. Lewis, quoted by Thomas Szasz. Now, we can look at Szasz, and here, again, you see a pretty cutting tone in Szasz. And Szasz, again, that might have worked against him, but also helped gain attention to some of his criticisms. Anyone with an ear for language recognizes that the boundary that separates the pretentious vocabulary of psychiatry from the ridiculous lexicon of psychobabble, and both from the everyday slang, is thin and permeable to fashion. Precisely therein lies the richness and power of language that is so extremely metaphoric. Should a person want to say something sensitive tactfully, he can, as the adage suggests, say it in jest but mean it in earnest. Bureaucrats, lawyers, politicians, quacks, and the sordid mountebanks of the Hindenburg professionals are in the habit of saying everything in earnest. If we want to protect ourselves from them, we had better hear what they tell us in jest, lest the bad joke be on us. So again, very cutting. But what the heart of his critique is that he will say there's a confusion between the literal and metaphoric language of mental illness, that mental illness is better understood in metaphoric language. And some people recognize that, but even when recognizing that it's better as a metaphoric language, will treat it literally, as if it were literal. So another quote here then. The various versions of the APA's DSM are not classifications of mental disorders that people have. Instead, they are simply rosters of officially accredited psychiatric diagnoses constructed by a consensus group and task force appointed by officers of the APA. Now, the reasons for diagnosing, they can be varied. They can be positive versus or negative within various different ones. The scientific, which often looks primarily at contributions to the biological contributions, but also the psychological and social contributions. The professional, it can be a way of increasing one's power. That's something Szasz will talk about. Legally, to justify state-sanctioned interventions. That's another reason what Szasz argues that people will diagnose. Political or economic, it provides security, including job security. And personal, to enlist social support. So there are a variety of motivations that can come into play. And these are, I think, important, even though we can look beyond these five, and these five may not always be negative as Szasz puts them. But when we look at this, it does really point to we need to look at our motivations for diagnosing. So again, the critique, the core of it is that literal metaphoric misinterpretation. He also talks about the moral or political aspect, that it takes away responsibility from the individual. This is similar to some religious critiques, but a more balanced way of looking at this, that it can take away responsibility. And this is something that many therapists will talk about, is that when someone receives a diagnosis, sometimes they no longer take as much responsibility and use it as a way to avoid responsibility. Certainly, though, that's not everyone that does that. For some people, it's a way to help them take more responsibility and more appropriate responsibility. So keep in mind, this does not mean that there's no biological influences on behavior and diagnosis. It's more the question of role and whether diagnosis is, as a mental illness, is a beneficial and helpful way of thinking about these challenges. Szasz was a major influence on Ernest Becker, an important existential thinker that influenced a lot of existential psychology. Becker supported Szasz when he was removed from his teaching position, and Becker's support actually cost him his teaching position in the Department of Psychology. So he took some criticisms to do this. But Becker also advanced some of Szasz's ideas looking at criticisms of certain aspects of mental illness and some criticisms of Freud in particular. Now, Szasz was blacklisted from many of the psychiatric journals because of his positions, and Becker was an important support for him through this time. Okay, now as we move on to some of the other critiques, postmodern critiques, this views diagnosis as discourse, is about language, it looks at the aspects of power and culture, and views diagnosis as socially constructed. It's not a truth that exists out there somewhere. It's something that is created by individuals, and individuals in power influenced by cultural perspectives. There has been a strong movement towards alternatives in diagnosis then. A lot of this has been spearheaded by the Society for Humanistic Psychology, which is the division of the American Psychological Association. I want to talk a little bit about the influence of this movement over time. It began in 2011 with an open letter to the DSM-5. This was written by Sarah Kamens, who was at that time a graduate student. She now is still very involved in advancing the alternatives to diagnosis as a psychologist and a leader in the Society for Humanistic Psychology, and is currently a board member. But she played a very important role, as did others in the Society for Humanistic Psychology. The Society turned this open letter into an online petition. It met its original goal of 10,000 signatures quickly and increased its goal, and now is at over 15,000 signatures. Many organizations signed on to this, including the American Counseling Association and British Psychological Association, as well as many divisions of the APA. It received mention in the national media, including the front page mention in the USA Today newspaper. Through the success, the Society for Humanistic Psychology formed a committee on diagnostic alternatives. There are a number of influential people that have been a part of this over time. When we look at the original steering committee, included Sarah Kamens, who was the author of the open letter, Frank Farley, who's a past president of the American Psychological Association, as well as many divisions of the American Psychological Association, including Division 32, which is the Society for Humanistic Psychology. Peter Kinderman, who is a past president of the British Psychological Association and two-time past president of its Division on Clinical Psychology. John Raskin, who is an influential constructivist and critic of diagnosis and has a book coming out on contrasting perspectives on diagnosis. Lucy Johnstone, who's an influential British psychologist who has written a lot on case formalization. David Elkins, who is a two-time past president of the Society for Humanistic Psychology, has authored several books, including The Human Factors of Psychotherapy, as well as Humanistic Psychology, a Clinical Manifesto. Both of these provide strong criticisms of the medical model in psychology and push towards alternatives. So this committee also included many other psychologists from the United States, Britain, and others around the world as well. In 2014, the Society for Humanistic Psychology sponsored a global summit on diagnostic alternatives, again, that was attended by many influential leaders in the field of psychology from the United States, Britain, and Australia, and supported by many more than this. There were two special issues of the Journal of Humanistic Psychology beginning 2017 that focused on this. The Society for Humanistic Psychology continues to function promoting alternatives. You can see a lot of the work over time at the website listed below here on Diagnostic Summit, the DX Summit. So you can read a lot of the articles a part of this. And there's also the forthcoming textbook that I mentioned, Abnormal Psychology, Contrasting Perspectives by John Raskin. And you can see and follow some about this on ResearchGate, and it will be out fall of 2018. So the move for diagnostic alternatives has been strong. There have been even some pilot projects with insurance companies where insurance companies were working with therapists without diagnosis, something that has not been done historically very often, but is a very positive sign to see insurance companies willing to look at alternatives as well. So there has been a lot of important work, and continues to be important work, looking at these alternatives. So when we step back and look over time, we can see how conceptions of mental illness emerged in a lot of more spiritual or religious contexts, moved into philosophical, medical, and psychological approaches over time, a lot through the emphasis on trying to destigmatize. But what was intended to destigmatize later, many will argue, provide a solid basis for stigmatization that has continued today. So now we are seeing, in the last 5 years, some really strong movements at looking at new alternatives that are, again, trying to move beyond stigma, again, trying to address some of the concerns about people who are given diagnoses and labels of mental illness are treated, and to move towards more humane treatments. When we look at the impact of some of these alternatives, then, it's brought together many organizations voicing concern about current diagnostic systems. They may have different reasons for being concerned, but they've come together trying to find common ground to find alternatives. The American Psychiatric Association felt pushed to respond to a lot of the criticism in the open letter, which shows that they recognized how strong this criticism was, how popular the criticisms were becoming. There's been a shift in many agencies and insurance companies from the DSM to the ICD-10. It's not clear how much this has to do with the open letter and the Diagnostic Summit and the criticisms connected to these, but it does seem likely that these played some role in that. Again, that's not something that I can say definitively. There's been increased energy towards the alternatives, including the options of third-party payment that I mentioned. At least one system has been tested with insurance companies for reimbursement without diagnosis. This concludes the lecture. Hopefully this provides some context for thinking about diagnosis, and maybe thinking about diagnosis in some different ways than what you had previously, both recognizing some positive aspects of the history as well as many of the limitations, and recognizing the current trends, with this important trend at looking at some different perspectives and different approaches to thinking about mental illness.